The first thing that greeted me wasn't silence. It was scent. Fresh paint, sharp but strangely comforting, lingered in the hallways like a reminder that something here was unmarked, unclaimed until me. Sunlight fractured against the glass panes, pouring across the hardwood floors in broken streams, and I thought this is the first morning in decades where I am not waking in someone else's shadow. My name is Evelyn Tran. I am 41 years old, and for the first time in my adult life, the space I occupy has my name on it. Not my late husband's. Not my parents'. Not borrowed or temporary. Mine. The sound of the keys echoed louder than expected when I set them down on the kitchen counter. A metallic clink like a gavel striking, sealing the verdict that I was no longer a guest in my own life. They were simple brass keys attached to a plastic tag the realtor had scribbled on in black marker, but to me they felt like crown jewels. I pressed my palm against the cool countertop, the marble still smelling faintly of construction dust, and I imagined my handprint staying there, invisible but permanent. A signature the world couldn't crop out. Inside my tote bag, tucked between a notepad and the Polaroid camera I couldn't resist bringing, was the deed. A thin folder of legal paper. Nothing glamorous. Its corners already soft from my constant checking. Every time doubt crept in, was this too much? Did I deserve this? Would they let me keep it? I opened the folder and reread the words, Evelyn Tran, sole owner. I'd slide the page back inside, careful, almost reverent, like someone guarding scripture. I had spent years in borrowed air, first in the house that belonged to my husband, a place where his family's photographs outnumbered mine. After he passed, I shrank into my son's basement where one small window gave me a slice of sky and nothing more. For too long, my life was stitched together with gratitude that felt like apology. Always aware that I was allowed to be there, but never that I belonged. Now the walls smelled of new beginnings. The sea stretched wide outside my sliding glass doors, and the wind carried salt instead of mildew. I poured myself a cup of coffee from a brand new machine, the steam rising like a benediction, and I told myself out loud just to hear it. This house is mine. I walked slowly through the rooms, barefoot, letting my steps mark territory. The living room still half empty, except for boxes carried echoes when I spoke. The upstairs bedroom caught morning light at an angle that made the white curtains glow. On the back deck, the ocean sounded like applause, steady, relentless, as if the waves themselves approved my claim. Ownership, I realized, wasn't just a word written on a deed. It was a weight in my chest, both terrifying and exhilarating. It meant I had no one to blame if the roof leaked, no one else to wait on if the pipes broke. It also meant that every creak of these floors, every hum of the refrigerator was mine to listen to, mine to decide upon, mine to protect. I took out my Polaroid and snapped a picture of the keys where they lay on the counter. The film developed slowly, a soft gray turning into brass, the faint outline of my hand near the frame. Evidence. Not for Instagram, not for family approval, but for myself. Proof that this wasn't a dream I'd wake from, not another space someone could take away. That morning, the house didn't yet feel warm. It felt raw, unsettled, like a stage waiting for a performance. But under the new paint and unmarked walls was something steadier, permanence. A chance to root my name into timber and stone. I pressed the folder with the deed against my chest before sliding it into the drawer beside the fridge, almost ceremonial. For once, I didn't have to ask permission to put it there. For once, no one would tell me to move my things to make room for theirs. For once, I could breathe without apology. I had worked for this, saved for this, fought through nights of doubt and mornings of exhaustion for this. And as the tide pushed and pulled against the shore, I let the rhythm match my own heartbeat. The house wasn't just shelter, it was evidence. And I intended to guard it like truth itself. The phone rang just as I was unpacking another box of dishes. It wasn't the soft trill of a neighbor introducing themselves or a contractor confirming repairs. It was sharper, faster, my sister's ringtone, the one I never managed to change. Clara Carter, PR executive spotlight addict, older by 3 years, but forever acting as if she had been born with the deed to my life. I hesitated before answering, my fingers hovering over the screen. For 3 days, this house had been quiet, mine alone, a silence textured by the sea and the hum of appliances. That ring pierced it like glass shattering. When I finally swiped to accept, I pressed the phone too tightly against my ear, bracing myself. Her voice spilled out before I could even say hello. Bright, brisk, commanding. We'll be there in 3 hours, 18 people. Get blankets and food ready. No question mark. No pause. Not even the courtesy of pretending it was a request. It was a press release, a headline delivered by the woman who had built her entire career on staging rooms and cropping photos until she was the center. I stood in my kitchen, the morning light stretching across the counter, and stared at the keys I'd set down earlier. They didn't clink this time. They just lay there silent as if waiting to see what I'd do. The deed in its folder was only a few feet away, tucked in the drawer like a talisman. I felt the urge to take it out to read my name aloud into the phone to remind her this wasn't a hotel. This wasn't hers to schedule. But Clara never listened to ownership, not when it came from me. To her, everything with the word family attached was common property. My success. Our success. My savings. Our cushion. My house. Our summer place. She curated every narrative until my presence was reduced to a cropped edge, the invisible frame that held up her picture. I pressed the phone tighter. 3 hours, I asked, my voice quieter than I wanted. Yes, she said, already moving on in her tone, already arranging in her head the seating, the photographs, the captions that would follow. Don't stress. Just make sure the fridge is full and there are enough towels. You'll manage. Manage. As if I were staff. As if this place was an Airbnb she had pre-booked and I was the concierge on call. My eyes drifted to the Polaroid I had snapped that morning, the brass keys glowing faintly against the marble counter. Proof. I had taken the picture because I wanted evidence, a reminder that I wasn't dreaming. Now I realized it was also a shield. Something I might need to hold up like a mirror against her entitlement. I wanted to ask the obvious. Who are these 18 people? But I knew the answer wouldn't matter. Clara collected people the way others collect seashells, pretty fragile, disposable. Coworkers who laughed at her jokes, friends who reposted her staged photos, boyfriends of friends who barely knew my name. They'd all arrive like waves, crashing and rearranging furniture, drinking the wine I had bought for myself, calling it family. The ocean roared outside the sliding glass doors louder than before, as if it sensed the coming storm. I looked at the tide and felt a strange parallel, how quickly water fills what is empty. How fast it erases the edges. My house wasn't even settled yet, and already the invasion had been scheduled. Clara. I started, my voice finding a firmer shape, but she was already talking over me. It'll be fun, she said. You'll thank me later. Trust me, this is exactly the kind of moment people remember. A beach house family gathered laughter pictures at sunset. It'll be perfect. Perfect for her feed, her story, her carefully polished brand. Not for me. The call ended before I could argue. A cheerful goodbye, a click, and then silence again. But not the silence of belonging I had savored earlier. This one was crowded thick with the echo of her command. I set the phone down slowly next to the keys as if the objects might cancel each other out. One was ownership. The other was invasion. Between them, I felt suspended, uncertain which would define the day. I opened the drawer and pulled out the deed, smoothing the page on the counter until the paper lay flat. My name stared back at me, steady, undeniable Evelyn Tran. Not Clara, not family, me. For a moment, the sunlight caught the notary's stamp and the ink glistened like armor. I traced the seal with my fingertip and whispered it again this time. Louder. Mine. The waves outside kept rolling in. 3 hours. 18 people. My sister's voice still echoed, but so did the deed. And I understood that what was about to happen wasn't just a visit. It was a test. As soon as Clara hung up, I leaned against the counter and let the silence return. But silence has its own tricks. It doesn't stay empty. It fills itself with memory, unspooling like an old film reel you thought you'd stored too far back to reach. I was suddenly 8 again, standing on a wooden stool in our mother's kitchen, stirring a pot of soup with a spoon almost as long as my arm. I had measured the salt, carefully chopped the carrots with clumsy precision, burned the tips of my fingers on steam I didn't respect. Clara swept in at the end, hairbrushed smile, practiced aprons spotless. When the family sat down that evening, it was her name that floated over the bowls. Clara's soup is delicious, our father had said. She nodded modestly, tilting her head just enough for the compliments to land like pearls on her necklace. I sat across the table, lips raw from tasting broth, too often hands smelling of onion, and kept quiet. The pattern didn't stop there. Years later, I stayed up late finishing an extra credit project for school, a trifold poster with statistics and hand-drawn charts. I had copied numbers from library books, shaded pie charts until the pencil stubs broke. The morning of the presentation, Clara, 2 grades ahead of me, asked if she could borrow it just to look. By afternoon, she was the one standing in the gymnasium, pointing to my graphs, her voice firm and confident. Teachers clapped, classmates admired. My name wasn't mentioned. When I raised my hand timidly from the bleachers, the teacher thought I had a question. Even our photo albums carried her fingerprints. Clara, in the center of every frame, her arms draped around cousins and friends, her smile the brightest light in the picture. If I was there at all, it was as an elbow at the edge, a shoulder caught by accident. Later, when she posted those same pictures online, she cropped even that. My image trimmed away, forgotten. The background to her story. I keep a box of Polaroids in my closet, pictures I took with the cheap camera I saved up for as a teenager. I wanted proof that I had been present, proof the world wouldn't erase. When I flip through them now, the evidence is still bitterly clear. Clara in the middle. Clara laughing, Clara pointing to the birthday cake. And me. Sometimes blurry, sometimes blocked by a candle flame, sometimes missing altogether. I never showed those pictures to anyone. They weren't for the family scrapbook. They were receipts. That box had come with me to this beach house. I'd tucked it on the top shelf of the bedroom closet above the sweaters I hadn't unpacked yet. On mornings like this, when her voice still buzzed in my ear, I thought about dragging it down, spreading the photos across the bed like cards, and reminding myself this is the pattern. She takes, I disappear. She speaks, I swallow. She shines, I blur. But the Polaroids also whispered something else. They told me that even if the world cropped me, I had still been there. My hands had stirred the soup. My pencil had drawn the charts. My face, half hidden, had watched the candles flicker out. Evidence of presence, even if no one credited me. That was why the deed mattered so much. It was my uncropped photo, my name written in full, my ownership not filtered through her smile. I didn't need Clara's spotlight to validate it. I needed the stamp, the ink, the line where my name stood alone. Still, memory has a way of planting doubt. I wondered as I stared at the folder in the drawer whether Clara would find a way to crop me out again. Maybe she'd bring her 18 people and fill this house with their laughter, and when the Polaroids appeared later, I'd be the blurred figure holding a tray mistaken for a hired helper. Maybe she'd stand on this deck at sunset, glass raised, and everyone would nod. Clara's beach house is beautiful. The thought made my stomach tighten, but it also steadied me. Because for the first time, I had a counterweight. Not a blurred photo, not a forgotten credit. A document. A deed. I took the Polaroid camera from the counter and turned it toward myself, framing the kitchen in the background, the keys on the marble, the folder just visible at the edge. I pressed the shutter. The film slid out with its soft mechanical sigh, and I shook it gently, waiting for my face to emerge. This time I would be in the center. This time no one else could crop me out. I pinned the picture with a magnet to the fridge, leaving it there like a witness. My own pattern rewritten. By late afternoon, the quiet rhythm of the house was broken. At first, it was just the low rumble of engines faint at the edge of the road like distant thunder gathering. Then the sound grew multiplied until it was no longer a storm on the horizon, but a caravan pressing down my street. SUVs, one after another, pulling up like they had been choreographed. Their doors swung open in unison. The invasion had arrived. Children spilled out, first small bodies propelled forward with the energy of release, their sneakers slapping the pavement as they shrieked toward the house. Their laughter was not the kind that warms a space, it was the kind that drowns it. Suitcases followed, hurled up the porch steps with a thud that made my front door tremble. Someone dragged a cooler, its plastic wheels grinding across the concrete. Another shouted for help with bags as if the street had turned into a loading dock. I stood inside behind the glass of the sliding doors, watching the tide of movement. My hand hovered over the handle, torn between stepping out to assert something, anything, and staying hidden long enough to measure what was being taken from me. And then I saw her. Mrs. Keene. She was exactly where I expected her to be, across the street just outside her garden fence leash, in hand her old terrier at her feet. She was 62, maybe 63 now, her hair pinned in its usual tight bun posture straight, despite the weight of years. The dog sniffed lazily at the grass, but her eyes were sharp, unblinking, locked on the scene unfolding at my doorstep. Mrs. Keene had always carried herself like a witness in waiting. She never interrupted, never called across, but she missed nothing. People underestimated her, mistaking her polite nods and quiet walks for detachment. I knew better. She saw everything. The arguments that flared at block parties, the late-night deliveries, people thought no one noticed the subtle shifts in who parked where and who suddenly didn't. And now she was watching my family unload themselves into my house as if it were a resort. Her gaze met mine through the glass. It wasn't sympathetic, not yet. It was something steadier, almost judicial. The kind of look that said, "I see this, Evelyn. You're not imagining it." Behind me, the house seemed to flinch at every new sound. A suitcase crashed against the threshold. A child's sticky hand slapped the freshly painted wall. Someone laughed, a high-pitched squeal that echoed through the entryway, as if mocking the emptiness I had carefully preserved. I reached for the folder with the deed, though I didn't open it. Just the feel of the cardboard under my fingertips grounded me. Ownership was written in ink, but in this moment it felt like it had to be defended in flesh and bone. Clara appeared last, of course. Perfect timing, like a star arriving once the stage had been set. She emerged from the largest SUV sunglasses pushed onto her head, her voice carrying over the noise as if amplified. "Everyone inside. Let's make ourselves at home. 2 words that twisted like a knife. I glanced again at Mrs. Keene. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply tightened her grip on the leash, her terrier tugging impatiently at her feet. Her head tilted the slightest degree, her version of acknowledgement, and then she held still, watching, recording, bearing witness in the only way she knew, by refusing to look away. The front door opened wide, though I hadn't touched it. Feet stampeded and voices overlapped the once quiet air, replaced with a roar. I felt the walls shrink, the floor tilt. My house was no longer breathing with me. It was gasping under their weight. I stayed at the glass a moment longer, hands still on the deed, eyes still on Mrs. Keene. Because while my family might pretend none of this was unusual, while they might tell me later I was exaggerating, I knew the truth was visible in that woman's stare. She saw. She catalogued. She confirmed what I already knew deep in my bones: the invasion had begun. The noise of their arrival hadn't yet settled when I noticed it, the small sound that sliced through the chaos like a scalpel. Not the thud of luggage on the stairs, not the crash of a glass dropped in the sink, not even the rising chorus of voices competing for space. It was the faint metallic jingle of my keys. The chime was unmistakable. They had hung by the door since the first day, clipped neatly on a hook I had installed myself, the brass catching light whenever I passed. To me, they weren't just keys. They were the boundary line, the hard evidence that this house, this fragile sanctuary, belonged to me. I turned in time to see her. Aunt Margaret. My father's sister, though she wore her relation like a crown heavier than blood. She wasn't loud like Victor, nor dazzling like Clara. Margaret was the kind of person who could slip her hand into your pocket while complimenting your dress, and you wouldn't notice until hours later. She stood near the entryway, her lips curved in a mild smile as she reached for the ring of keys. Her movement was casual, almost lazy, the way one might pluck a tissue from a box. She twirled the ring, once the brass chiming like a bell of possession, then slid it neatly into her handbag. "I'll hold on to these." She set her tone, the practiced softness of someone who had been excusing herself her entire life. "Safer with me. Safer with her." The words burrowed like splinters. I wanted to shout, to demand their return, to snatch the keys back from her bag before the zipper closed. But the room was full: cousins dragging duffels, children screaming for snacks, Clara orchestrating the distribution of bedrooms. My protest would sound shrill against their laughter. My outrage would be painted as paranoia. Instead, I stood still, the notepad heavy in my hand. Without speaking, I flipped it open to a fresh page and wrote, "Margaret took the keys at 4:23 p.m. The act was both instinct and ritual. Record it, seal it, make the evidence undeniable. Because I knew what the gesture meant. The keys weren't about doors or locks. They were about lines, who was inside, who was outside, and who got to decide. By slipping them into her purse, Margaret had drawn the map herself. Evelyn doesn't guard the threshold. Family does. She had declared without needing to raise her voice that my ownership was only temporary, only tolerated. That the door could be opened or closed at her will, not mine. I looked up. Margaret's smile hadn't faltered. She stood chatting with another cousin as if she hadn't just pocketed my claim to safety. Her hand rested lightly on her bag, one finger tapping the leather, the rhythm of possession. No one else noticed. Clara was handing out towels like party favors, children were unwrapping chips in the living room, Victor was booming his opinions about where the grill should go. It was a theater, and Margaret's theft was a silent scene change unseen by the audience but felt in the air. The house itself seemed to react. The front door rattled when the wind pressed against it, but the sound no longer comforted me. It wasn't mine to answer. My keys were missing, and without them, I felt like a guest in my own threshold. I lowered my eyes back to the notepad. I circled the entry 3 times, pressing the pen harder with each loop until the indentation tore slightly through the page. Keys, boundary. I underlined it twice. A note to myself, a warning, an anchor. Because when the day ended and someone inevitably said, "Don't exaggerate, Evelyn," I would have the words right here. I would have the timestamp, the evidence. From across the room, Mrs. Keene's window glimmered faintly in the dusk. I imagined her watching, though I couldn't see her face clearly now. Perhaps she had seen the gesture, the slight curl of Margaret's hand, the drop of brass into leather. Perhaps not. Either way, I wrote it down because someone had to. Margaret laughed at something a cousin said, her hand brushing against her purse again. To anyone else, it was meaningless. To me, it was a lock turned against its rightful keyholder. The ocean's roar pressed louder through the glass doors as if the waves themselves knew the breach had begun. And inside, I stood still with my notepad recording, documenting, archiving. Because if no one else would guard the line, I would at least draw it. In ink, if not in steel. It began with Clara's voice. It always did. She didn't raise it, not exactly. Clara never needed volume. She had projection, that uncanny ability to slice through noise and pin everyone's attention like a spotlight. She stood in the center of my living room, her sunglasses perched on her head like a crown, her hands clapping twice to gather the crowd. "Shoes off at the door," she called brightly, "and leave your bags in the hall. Evelyn will tidy everything later." A ripple of movement followed obedient. Shoes tumbled into a pile by the door, scuffed sneakers and polished loafers collapsing into each other. Bags slumped in crooked rows along the wall, some unzipped spilling swimsuits, damp towels, crumbs. It happened so quickly, so seamlessly, that I almost believed it was a rehearsal she had staged before. Clara issued the line, and the room rearranged itself to match her vision. And me, I was written into the scene as staff. Not host, not owner, not even sister. Just a silent figure hovering at the edges there to manage the mess, to make sure the story played smoothly for everyone else. I stood with my back against the counter, trying to stretch a smile across my face, though it felt stiff foreign. My lips ached from the effort of pretending it was fine, pretending I didn't feel erased in my own house. Inside, the words piled up. "This is mine. I worked for this. You don't get to assign me chores like a maid." But they stayed locked behind my teeth, because I knew what would happen if I spoke. The laughter would sharpen, the cousins would exchange glances, and Clara would tilt her head with that practiced pity. "Don't be so dramatic, Evelyn. Don't ruin the mood." So instead, I picked up a stray pair of sandals and set them neatly against the wall. I smoothed down a towel that had fallen half out of a bag. I played the part Clara had written for me, even as I hated it, even as I recorded the scene silently in my mind like another Polaroid, Clara's voice commanding. Shoes scattered. My silence rebranded as compliance. I thought of the notepad waiting in the drawer by the fridge pages already filled with timestamps and details, Margaret pocketing the keys. Victor's booming claims of family ownership. Clara's call demanding 18 people in 3 hours. Another entry would join them tonight. 6:12 p.m. Clara assigns Evelyn as cleaner. The smile on my face was a mask, but the notepad would be truth. Children ran past me barefoot, now sticky footprints smearing across the hardwood I had polished just 2 days ago. Their laughter was shrill, uncontained. One knocked over the vase of flowers I had set on the table that morning, water spilling onto the floor petals scattering. Clara laughed lightly, sweeping a phone from her pocket to capture the moment, angling it just so. The caption was already written in her tone. Family chaos, but perfect together. Not one frame would show me wiping up the water. The weight of it pressed on me the way she curated every scene, every photo, every word. I wasn't sister here. I wasn't owner. I was background cropped again, the silent support holding up her performance. Still, I bent down, gathered the petals, and pressed them into a napkin. My hands trembled not with weakness, but with restraint. Each movement was evidence. Each task was a receipt I would write down later. Because if they insisted on scripting me as the help, I would at least document the theft. The ocean outside roared louder, as if mocking the false domesticity unfolding in my living room. Waves against shore, unrelenting, unedited, uncaring for anyone's spotlight. I straightened, forcing the smile again, my teeth aching with the effort. And in that moment, I understood the role had been rewritten, yes, but not permanently. Not if I kept recording. Not if I refused to erase myself this time. I let my eyes flick to Clara. She was arranging people for a group photo by the sliding glass doors, directing them with a conductor's precision. Her voice was smooth, commanding, irresistible. But for the first time, I felt a small, fierce resistance stir in my chest. Because no matter how many times she cropped me out, I still had the negatives. I still had the notepad. I still had the deed. And sooner or later, those would speak louder than her smile. The glass doors framed the ocean like a painting, but my eyes weren't on the horizon. They were drawn across the street to the familiar figure who had become more than a neighbor, an observer, a ledger, a kind of human archive. Mrs. Keene stood at her fence, her small terrier planted faithfully at her side, her posture straight against the twilight. Her gaze was steady, unhurried, not curious in the way neighbors usually are. She wasn't rubbernecking for drama, nor pretending to be busy with her garden while secretly eavesdropping. Mrs. Keene never pretended. She watched, and by watching, she recorded. Our eyes met through the glass. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She only dipped her chin in the slightest nod. But that nod carried weight heavier than 100 spoken words. It was acknowledgement. It was verification. It was, in its quiet way, a signature. Inside my living room had transformed into a marketplace. Cousins sprawled across the couches, children tore through the hallway in socked feet. Victor's booming laugh rattled the light fixtures. Clara posed near the windows, arranging her friends into a sunset photo. Her arm raised to angle the perfect shot. And there I was, hands busy, smile fixed my presence, rewritten once again as background. If it weren't for Mrs. Keene's eyes, I might have doubted myself. Gaslighting is easier when you've lived with it since childhood. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe keys in a purse were harmless. Maybe being assigned as cleaner was a joke I didn't get. But then I looked through the glass and saw her steady gaze, and I knew, no, this is real. Someone else sees it. Her eyes were the kind of evidence no family narrative could erase. The way she tilted her head slightly, as if marking time, was like a witness signing a deposition. Not loud, not dramatic, just true. I thought about the notepad in the drawer, the growing list of timestamps and details I had already written down. 4:23 p.m. Margaret took the keys. 6. 12 p.m. Clara assigned Evelyn as cleaner. And now another entry formed in my mind. 6:45 p.m. Mrs. Keene witnessed. Because in courtrooms, documents matter, but so do people. A single witness can unravel years of curated performance. The terrier tugged at her leash, but Mrs. Keene didn't move. She stayed rooted, her eyes scanning the house like she was memorizing each frame for later recall. The dog pawed the ground impatiently, but she held still, her shoulders squared, her silence firm. Behind me, Clara laughed into someone's camera, and I heard the click of another photo that would inevitably crop me out. Yet the glass reflected Mrs. Keene's nod back into the room, bouncing it onto me like light. For once, I felt less invisible. It struck me then the house had witnesses. Not just me, not just the ink on the deed, but eyes across the street, eyes that couldn't be edited out or dismissed. Clara could crop a photo. Victor could shout down my voice. Margaret could pocket the keys. But none of them could erase Mrs. Keene's simple, undeniable act of watching. The ocean roared behind her, the tide swelling as the sky darkened, but she stood still, her presence as sharp as the salt in the air. A neighbor, a widow, a woman who walked her dog at the same time every evening, ordinary, and yet in this moment, extraordinary. I pressed my palm against the glass, a quiet salute, though I didn't expect her to mirror it. She didn't need to. The nod had been enough. Later, when the house quieted and I reached for my notepad, I wrote it down in block letters. Witness present. Eyes confirm. Not alone. And as the ink dried, I felt something loosen in my chest. Because evidence isn't always paper or photographs. Sometimes it's simply the weight of another person's gaze, steady and unflinching. Saying without words, "You're right. I saw it too." It came as I knew it would in the form of a voice designed to fill a room. Victor Hale, my cousin, never spoke so much as he declared. His words didn't land, they struck bouncing off the walls as though the plaster itself were his audience. He had claimed the head of my dining table, of course, sitting with his elbows wide, a beer in one hand, his tie already loosened as if casualness itself was proof of authority. The room hushed when he began, not out of respect, but out of inevitability. Victor's voice was a tide. You either let it wash over you or drown trying to resist. He raised his glass eyes, glinting in the warm light. Let's be honest. He boomed, pausing to let the silence swell. Without family, Evelyn wouldn't even have this house. Isn't that right? The words hit harder than I expected, though. I should have braced myself. They were a verdict dressed as a toast, a declaration disguised as humor. A few chuckles followed, nervous obedient. Clara smirked into her phone, pretending to adjust the lighting for another picture. Margaret's hand brushed her purse with my keys inside like punctuation to his sentence. I forced a smile, brittle at the edges, while my stomach clenched. My tongue pressed hard against the roof of my mouth, keeping back every word that threatened to spill. Because I remembered. I remembered the graveyard shifts at the call center, my headset biting into my scalp as I spoke to strangers in the middle of the night. I remembered nodding through 12-hour accounting shifts, my back aching from chairs that were never meant to be sat in that long. I remembered the envelopes of bills I'd stacked in careful rows, rent, electricity, gas, water. Each receipt filed in a battered shoebox I kept under my bed like a secret trophy case. No one in that room had been there for those nights. Not Victor, not Clara, not Margaret. They hadn't been there when my paycheck barely covered the basics, when I worked double shifts just to chip away at savings. They hadn't seen me circle house listings in the classifieds with a pen I could barely afford, nor watched me walk through rental after rental where landlords glanced at me like I was asking for too much. But Victor's voice flattened all of that into nothing. Family makes us who we are. He continued slapping the table so the glasses rattled. Without us, where would you even be? The answer lived like fire in my chest. Right here. Exactly where I am. Because of me. Not you. But I swallowed it. Instead, I lowered my eyes to the table, tracing the condensation ring left by my glass, feeling the cool moisture against my fingertip. My notepad sat in my lap, the pen uncapped ready. Without lifting my head, I wrote 7:18 p.m. Victor. Without family, Evelyn wouldn't have this house. I pressed the letters harder than usual, the ink bleeding slightly into the paper as if I could nail his words down until they couldn't wriggle away. Clara laughed, her voice airy, dismissive. He's right, you know. We all help each other. That's what family does. Help. The word stung. I wanted to ask her which part of my 20 years of work she believed she had contributed to. Did she stay up with me during the nights when my hands cramped from typing invoices? Did she cover the months when my car broke down and I walked 3 miles to work? Did she pay a single utility bill in this house she now claimed as collective property? But I kept smiling. A tight, unnatural curve of lips that made my jaw ache. Because the rule had always been clear, my silence kept the peace. Their noise wrote the story. Victor's voice thundered again, this time punctuated with laughter from those too timid to oppose him. My head tilted slightly toward the window, and there, like a reminder, the faint outline of Mrs. Keene stood across the street, her porch light glowing her gaze steady. She couldn't hear his words, but her presence gave me strength. Witnesses weren't always in the room. Sometimes they were across the street holding the weight of your truth simply by not looking away. I flipped the page in my notepad and underlined my own handwriting, "Receipts matter." The shoebox of bills, the folders of pay, stubs the deed stamped in ink. Every long night, every shift, every sacrifice they lived there recorded. They couldn't be shouted down, not forever. Victor's words still rang in the air, but I clung to my records, to the truth inked in documents they couldn't crop out of the picture. His voice was loud, yes, but evidence, real evidence, doesn't need to shout. The golden light of dusk slipped into the house, painting everything in that soft, forgiving glow Clara loved. She called it the magic hour, the time when flaws blurred and smiles seemed brighter. To her, it wasn't just a time of day, it was a stage cue. Everyone gathered by the deck, she announced, her voice lilting but firm, corralling cousins, children, friends into a semicircle with the ocean behind them. She raised her arms like a director arranging a final tableau. People shuffled, laughed, smoothed their shirts, tugged at hair that had been tousled by the sea breeze. I lingered by the edge of the living room, clutching my notepad, uncertain whether to step forward or stay back. For a flicker of a moment, I thought maybe she would look for me, call me over, wave me into the frame. A sister standing with her sister, both women claiming this moment together. Instead, Clara turned, extended her phone, and pressed it into my hands. "You take the picture, Evelyn," she said, smiling as if she were offering me an honor instead of an exile. "You've got the steady hands." I froze. The phone was warm from her palm, its case glittering in the fading light. The screen lit up, showing the group she had arranged. Clara was in the center of coarse arm around Victor's shoulder head, tilted just so chin angled for the light. The others leaned inward, orbiting her like planets pulled by gravity. I lifted the phone, my hands obeying even as my chest tightened. The shutter clicked once, twice, 3 times. Each snap was a small erasure. Each frame cemented my absence. "Perfect," Clara declared, sweeping back to check the shots, her hair catching the glow as though the sun itself deferred to her. She swiped, nodded, and began to tap quickly. Within moments, the picture was online, caption-polished, hashtags lined like soldiers. I caught a glimpse before she pulled the screen away. Family laughter, love at the beach house. And there she was, radiant in the middle, everyone else arranged like scenery. Me nowhere. Not even reflected in the glass. A hollow laugh stirred in my throat but didn't escape. It wasn't the first time. It was an old ritual. In my mind, I was 12 again, standing off to the side at a birthday party holding a disposable camera while Clara posed with the cake. Later, when the photos came back from the drugstore, she was all over the album center stage in every shot. Me only, my hands appeared holding the camera, blurry in the corner, cropped away by the frame. The Polaroids I kept in the shoebox upstairs whispered their reminder I had been there, but no one wanted proof of me. Clara had mastered the art of curating absence. I placed her phone back on the counter, my fingers trembling just slightly. My notepad lay open beside it. I wrote in block letters, 7:42 p.m. Clara assigns me as photographer. Cropped out a family photo. The words looked harsh against the paper, like an indictment. For a moment, I considered reaching for my own Polaroid camera, the one I had used to capture the keys, the deed, my face in the kitchen. I imagined holding it up, turning it on myself, clicking the shutter while the others posed without me. A counter photo. Evidence. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I stepped back and watched Clara post another photo, her screen glowing like a stage light. Notifications buzzed almost instantly, like hearts, comments pouring in. Beautiful family. What a perfect night. So lucky to have each other. Lucky. I looked through the glass doors at the ocean, its waves relentless, unfiltered, refusing to crop themselves for anyone's approval. And I felt the contrast burning in me. Inside my smile was a mask. Outside, Mrs. Keene's porch light flickered on. A witness across the street, her gaze steady even if she couldn't see this particular theft. and I thought one day these cropped frames will collapse under the weight of the pictures I keep. Because truth doesn't vanish when edited. It waits patient, preserved in the negatives. I closed the notepad softly, pressing the pen into the crease like a blade sheathed. My role had been cut again, erased from the story written for the world to see. But I still had the receipts. And one day when the light was less forgiving, they would matter more than her smile. Dinner was supposed to be simple. I had imagined a quiet meal, bowls of pasta steaming on the table, the sound of forks clinking gently against plates, the ocean's breath filling the pauses between conversation. But that vision belonged to the first 3 days before the SUVs, before the keys, before Clara's arrival. Now the dining room felt like a banquet hall. Every chair pulled in, every surface covered wine bottles uncorked and scattered. The table groaned under the weight of platters I hadn't prepared alone yet. Somehow I was the only one sweating from the effort. My shoulders ached, my fingers raw from chopping and stirring, but no one noticed. Or maybe they did, and chose not to. Clara stood at the head of the table, her glass lifted high. She hadn't cooked, hadn't set the plates, hadn't lit the candles, but her voice claimed the moment like it always did. To family, she began her tone, bright, rehearsed, amplified for maximum reach. Everyone hushed. Even Victor leaned back, his booming laugh quieted in deference. Her eyes swept the room, lingering just long enough to gather every gaze. And then she delivered the line sharp and polished, as if it had been waiting on her tongue for days. "This house is not just Evelyn's," she said. "It's the legacy of our entire family." The words dropped into the silence like stones into water. And then the ripple came, the chorus of glasses rising, the clink of crystal meeting. Crystal, the murmurs of agreement. Legacy. Ours. Family. I sat halfway down the table, my hand wrapped around the stem of my wine glass, but I couldn't lift it. My palm was damp, my pulse loud in my ears. Legacy. The word stuck in my throat like a thorn. I looked at the faces glowing in the candlelight. Smiles all around, nods of satisfaction, as though Clara had bestowed a truth they all already knew. Margaret's eyes shone her purse with my keys tucked safely by her chair. Victor laughed into his drink, satisfied with his earlier sermon. Even the children clinked their glasses of juice, mimicking the adults' ritual. And me, I tightened my grip on the spoon in my hand. So tight the metal bent, curving under the pressure of my anger. My knuckles whitened. I could feel the tremor run up my arm, a tremor no one else seemed to notice. In my mind, I saw every night I had worked until dawn. The endless shifts, the shoebox of receipts. The bills paid one by one, carefully stacked proof that no one but me had carried the cost of this house. My name alone on the deed. Not Clara's. Not Victor's. Not Margaret's. Mine. But at this table, under the glow of candles and Clara's perfect smile, those facts evaporated. They raised their glasses and rewrote the story in unison. And I was expected to play along to toast my own erasure. I forced my lips into a smile, but my jaw ached. My spoon remained in my hand, bent slightly, now its curve a secret testament to what I couldn't say aloud. My notepad waited in the kitchen drawer, and I knew what I would write when I slipped away later. 8:10 p.m. Clara's toast. House declared family legacy. Agreement, unanimous clinking of glasses. The record would stand even if my voice didn't. Clara lowered her glass, satisfied, her phone already in her other hand, to capture a photo of the glowing faces, the raised drinks. Her caption wrote itself, I could almost hear it. Family first. Our legacy. Blessed. The photo would spread, likes would multiply, and no one would ever question the absence of my name in the story. But I knew. I bent the spoon in my hand further, my nails digging into my palm, my body a silent ledger of resistance. The candlelight flickered across the polished silver, catching the bend like a scar. Outside, the waves crashed against the shore, louder now, a percussion line to the theater inside. Across the street, Mrs. Keene's porch light burned steady, a quiet beacon that reminded me witnesses existed even if they weren't seated at this table. I didn't raise my glass. I didn't echo their toast. My silence was my only refusal, though no one noticed. In their chorus of agreement, my absence was just another crop, another erasure. But I felt the bent spoon in my hand warm from my grip, and I promised myself one day they would see the record. One day the receipts would speak louder than their toasts. That night, when the laughter finally dulled and the clinking of glasses gave way to snores from overfed cousins sprawled on couches, I slipped into the kitchen. The house was still full, but in the pockets of silence between their noise, I could finally breathe again. I pulled open the drawer by the refrigerator, the one place I had claimed as mine from the very first day, and took out my notepad. Its cover was worn already from these past few days, corners, bent pages, thick with indentation from words pressed too hard. To anyone else, it looked ordinary, the kind of notebook you forget in the backseat of a car. But to me, it was more than paper. It was weapon shield ledger. I sat at the counter under the soft hum of the kitchen light, flipped to a blank page, and began to write. 4:23 p.m. Margaret took the keys, said, "I'll hold on to these." Keys, boundary line. I pressed my pen hard into the page, tracing the words until the groove left scars on the sheet beneath. The memory replayed in my head, the jingle of brass, the casual theft, the purse snapping shut. I wrote it down so it couldn't dissolve into someone else's excuse later. Next line. 7:42 p.m. Clara handed me the phone. You take the picture. Evelyn not in frame. Posted online, cropped out again. I could still hear the shutter click, still see Clara's smile glowing in the center of the photo while I remained invisible, erased by her caption of family laughter love. I wrote until the letters blurred slightly, my hand tightening as though the pen itself needed to remember what my voice couldn't say aloud. Another line. 8:10 p.m. Dinner toast. Clara. This house is the legacy of the whole family. All glasses raised. Evelyn silent. Spoon bent. I paused after that one, staring at the words until the candlelight memory flared in my mind again. The clinking chorus, the way they rewrote my years of sacrifice in a single sentence. I rubbed my thumb over the bent spoon I had carried into the kitchen, laying it beside the notepad. Its warped curve shimmered under the fluorescent bulb. Proof of pressure, proof of restraint. The pages of the notebook were filling fast, each entry, a timestamp, each sentence, a receipt. It wasn't enough anymore to keep memories in my head where they could be dismissed as exaggeration or twisted into family jokes. Here on paper, the truth hardened. A quiet ledger no one could crop out. The ocean rumbled faintly through the cracked window waves, pulling and pressing against the shore. I let the sound guide my pen. Line after line, I wrote cataloging insults, gestures, erasures. The notebook became heavy in my hands, not with paper, but with weight, the kind of weight you feel when you finally realize you are not crazy. You are not alone. You are simply recording what others prefer to deny. Across the street, I imagined Mrs. Keene closing her curtains for the night. Her dog curled at her feet. Her memory of the day filed away in her own quiet way. A witness, yes. But this here was my testimony. I turned back a few pages and reread the earlier entries. Each one was like a nail hammered into wood, undeniable, permanent. Margaret's keys, Clara's command, Victor's booming claim, Clara's toast. The cropping, the laughter, the erasures. Every moment I had swallowed became ink. For the first time all day, I felt steady. Not happy, not safe, but steady. Because as long as the words existed here, as long as I kept writing, I had evidence stronger than their noise. My notepad was no longer just a notebook. It was my weapon. And one day, when the chorus of denial rose again, when they tried to laugh me into silence, I would open these pages, and the record would speak for itself. I set down my pen, closed the cover with a firm hand, and placed the bent spoon on top of it, a marker, a reminder. The hum of the refrigerator filled the room. Outside, the waves kept breaking, relentless, honest, unedited. In the quiet of my kitchen, my ledger lay waiting. This chapter transforms Evelyn's notepad into a weaponized form of truth, turning each entry into a receipt she can wield against the family's erasures. It happened in the kitchen late the next morning when the house was already humming with the weight of too many bodies. The air smelled faintly of burnt toast, damp towels, and salt carried in from the open deck doors. Cousins shouted over one another about surfing children, scattered cereal across the floor, and in the middle of it all, Clara leaned casually against the counter, directing the chaos with a glass of orange juice in her hand, like a queen with a scepter. I had been cleaning since sunrise. Plates, stacked floors, swept beds stripped and remade for the second wave of guests who were stopping by. Every surface bore fingerprints that weren't mine. Every room carried voices I hadn't invited. The weight of it pressed down on me until my chest ached until the words finally forced their way out. I stood at the sink water dripping from my hands and turned toward her. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut sharp through the noise. "Clara, this isn't a hotel." The words felt heavier than I expected, heavy enough to silence the nearest conversations. A cousin froze with a spoon halfway to his mouth. One of the children stopped mid-shriek. For a moment, there was only the sound of the faucet steady and insistent like a metronome keeping time for my declaration. Clara didn't flinch. She never did. She turned her head slowly, her lips curving into that familiar smile, the one polished by years of boardrooms and photo ops. She sipped her juice swallowed and let her laughter ring out soft and dismissive like a bell chime at the end of a joke no one else understood. "Don't be dramatic," she said, her tone as smooth as the silk blouse she wore. "Family first." The words fell like a gavel, quick and final. Around the table, shoulders relaxed, spoons moved again. Children resumed their shrieks. My confrontation had lasted all of 10 seconds before being smothered under the script Clara had been reciting her entire life. I stood there, towel clenched in my hands, my heart pounding against my ribs. "Don't be dramatic." The phrase curled around me like smoke choking poisonous. I wanted to shout back, to list every bill I had paid, every hour I had worked, every receipt stacked in my shoebox of proof. I wanted to remind her that family first was never the motto when I was scraping coins to cover utilities, when I was walking home in the rain after double shifts, when I was the one building the savings she now trampled. But my throat tightened. Because I knew what would follow if I pushed further. The rolling eyes, the laughter, the collective agreement that Evelyn always made a scene. I could already hear Victor's booming chuckle, Margaret's soft sigh, Clara's cutting quip. "She exaggerates. She doesn't know how to enjoy herself." So I swallowed it. The towel twisted in my hands until the fabric pulled taut, my knuckles white. I turned back to the sink, staring at the silverware piled in soapy water. My reflection wavered in the suds distorted, cropped again. But even as I stayed silent, I reached for the notepad lying open on the counter, half hidden under a dish towel. My pen scratched across the page, 9:37 a.m. Evelyn to Clara. "This isn't a hotel, Clara. Don't be dramatic, family first, dismissive." The words steadied me. Ink on paper where my voice had been dismissed in air. Behind me, Clara clinked her glass against someone's coffee mug, laughing at something else now already moving the story along. But I could feel the groove of my pen through the page, deep and permanent. They could crop me out of photos, laugh me out of conversations, silence me at tables. But they couldn't erase the ledger. I glanced once toward the window. Mrs. Keene wasn't outside yet, but I imagined her steady gaze anyway, the nod that had anchored me before. Witnesses weren't always visible, but the thought of her eyes kept me upright. I closed the notepad gently, slid it back under the towel, and dried my hands. Clara's words still rang in the room, but my evidence was louder to me. Louder and patient. Because family might raise their glasses and declare ownership, might laugh me into the role of maid, might dismiss me with a single phrase, but the notepad never dismissed. It recorded. It remembered. And one day, it would answer back. The house was still vibrating from the confrontation when the knock came. It wasn't loud, just 3 gentle raps against the door, so soft they almost blended with the ocean's breath outside. For a moment, no one moved. My family sat frozen around the dining table, wine glasses half raised, the folder still lying open like a wound in the center. I rose before anyone else could. My hands trembled only slightly as I crossed the room. I opened the door, and there she was, Mrs. Keene. She stood on my porch in her sensible shoes, a cardigan pulled tight against the evening air, her small terrier nestled against her calf. The porch light cast a halo on her silver hair, but it was her eyes that anchored me, clear, sharp, unwavering. She leaned closer, lowering her voice so only I could hear. "They can't claim this house," she said, her tone firm, unflinching. "Not if the papers are in your name." Behind me, the folder sat on the dining table, its edge catching the light. The deed peeked from inside the notary's seal, still visible, a quiet gleam against the clutter of empty plates and wine bottles. I swallowed hard, the air catching in my throat. Mrs. Keene's words weren't loud, but they carried the gravity of a signature. She wasn't offering opinion. She was confirming fact. Her gaze flicked past my shoulder into the room where Clara sat stiff, her phone abandoned. Her smile cracked. Victor leaned back. Arms crossed, his voice silenced by the weight of paper. Margaret's purse was still at her side, her fingers twitching over its clasp. The others shifted, restless, uncertain, watching this small, ordinary woman deliver a truth none of them could refute. Mrs. Keene's dog tugged lightly at the leash, but she held her ground. Her hand brushed against mine, not quite a touch, but close enough to steady me. "Don't let them rattle you," she added softly. "Paper doesn't lie." I nodded, unable to find words. My eyes burned not with weakness, but with the sudden relief of being seen, confirmed, witnessed. For so long I had been gaslit into silence, told I was dramatic, ungrateful, imagining things. And here in the doorway of my own house, my neighbor, a woman with no stake, no agenda, had stamped my reality as fact. When I turned back toward the table, I saw it differently. The folder wasn't just mine anymore. It was alive in the room, laced with the weight of two witnesses, my own meticulous ledger and Mrs. Keene's unblinking eyes. I walked back slowly, every step echoing. The silence deepened, thicker than before. My family avoided my gaze, each of them finding refuge in their glasses, their plates, their folded hands. Only Daniel from the far end kept looking at me, his earlier words. "She's right, hanging like a bridge across the divide." I placed the folder gently back in the center of the table. The deed slipped slightly out of the pocket, the seal glinting once more. The receipts fanned just enough to show the lines of ink, each bill a testimony. My phone screen darkened after replaying Clara's voice memo, but its presence was still felt heavy and undeniable. Mrs. Keene gave one last nod from the doorway before stepping back, her figure framed by the night. She didn't need to stay. She had delivered what mattered: confirmation, validation, the external eye no family narrative could erase. I closed the door slowly, my hand firm on the handle, and returned to my chair. My spoon lay bent beside my plate, a relic of restraint. My notepad was tucked under my arm, its pages swelling with ink. The folder lay between us, all its evidence gleaming like steel. Clara shifted, opening her mouth as if to recover the stage, but no words came. Victor cleared his throat, but the sound dissolved into nothing. Margaret kept her hand on her purse, but it looked less like power now and more like desperation. And me? For the first time, I felt tall at that table. Not because I had shouted, not because I had begged, but because the truth had found a second voice. The ocean roared beyond the glass doors, steady and relentless, a rhythm older than any family script. And inside the folder's edges caught the light glowing faintly, as though reminding them all this house has a name. That name is mine. By nightfall, the air inside the house felt heavier than the salt wind pressing against the windows. The laughter had grown loud, the wine bottles lined like trophies, and the table stretched into a stage where everyone else played their parts without hesitation. I sat among them, my notepad tucked close, the folder pressed against my ribs like armor. My pulse drummed in my ears, not from fear, but from resolve. When the moment arrived, I knew. Clara was mid-story, her voice weaving through the room, her gestures wide, her glass raised like a spotlight. Victor chimed in, booming as always. Legacy Margaret nodded in rhythm, her purse clutched at her side like contraband no one dared question. The chorus was swelling again, rewriting history, cementing my erasure in a language they all understood. I stood. The chair scraped sharply against the floor, slicing through the noise. Heads turned, annoyance flickering first, then confusion when they saw the folder in my hands. Without a word, I carried it to the center of the table and let it fall. The thud wasn't loud, but it was final. "This is mine," I said. My voice didn't tremble. I opened the folder, pulling out the deed first, laying it flat for all of them to see. My name glared up from the page, black ink on white, the notary's seal gleaming under the light. Next came the receipts fanned across the table like cards. Utilities, repairs, tax statements, each one stamped, dated my handwriting in the margins. Each one a log of the nights they weren't there, the bills they never saw, the sacrifices they didn't care to imagine. And finally, I slid my phone forward. A tap of my finger, and Clara's voice filled the room, recorded and undeniable. "We'll be there in 3 hours. 18 people. Get blankets and food ready." The sound echoed against the walls. Clara's polished smile froze her glass-arrested midair. The room went silent, so silent I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the crash of the waves outside like a gavel against the shore. "Not yours," I said, my palm flat on the deed. "Not a hotel. Not a legacy. Mine. Paper doesn't lie." The silence thickened. No laughter to smooth it, no toast to drown it. Victor shifted his mouth opening as if to thunder another declaration, but nothing came. Margaret's fingers twitched at her purse, but the purse itself looked suddenly small, pathetic compared to the weight of ink and stamps spread across the table. Clara tried to laugh a brittle sound, but it shattered before it could form. For the first time, their eyes flicked downward, forced to read what they could no longer deny. The evidence sat between us, alive louder than their voices had ever been. And then, from the far end of the table, a voice broke through. Daniel, the cousin who had been silent all night, the one who never dared to tilt the balance, leaned forward. His voice wasn't booming like Victor's or polished like Clara's. It was quiet but clear. "She's right," he said. The words hung in the air, fragile and enormous all at once. A crack split the facade, the first fissure in their wall of entitlement. I saw it in the flicker of eyes, the uneasy shifting of chairs, the way glasses were lowered without clinking. Clara's face stiffened, her narrative slipping. Victor's hand drummed once against the table, but even his bluster couldn't bridge the silence. I gathered the papers back into the folder, slowly, deliberately. Not to hide them, but to remind them that I controlled where the truth lived. The weight of it was steady in my hands, steadier than their noise, steadier than my own racing heart. The ocean roared outside, steady, relentless, reminding me of what was real, what couldn't be rewritten by a toast or a caption. And in that silence and the shock that lingered across their faces, I knew the tide had shifted. For once, I wasn't cropped out. For once, the frame held me at its center, evidence spread like armor, truth undeniable. By the time the last SUV pulled away, the house exhaled. The noise that had swelled for days collapsed into absence, leaving behind only the faint smell of wine, the echo of children's footsteps on the stairs, and crumbs scattered like evidence across the counter. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick, pulsing alive, as if the walls themselves were relieved to finally rest. I stood in the doorway watching the taillights fade into the night and let my body unclench. My shoulders sagged, my jaw loosened. For days, I had been bracing against an invisible tide, and now it was gone, retreating down the road. What remained was mine. The first thing I did was reach for the hook by the door. The keys were missing, of course. Margaret's purse had swallowed them days ago. But instead of despair, I felt clarity. Tomorrow morning, I told myself I would change the locks. Not reclaim the old keys, but create new ones, sharp and untainted, cut in my name. Keys that had never touched her hands. I walked into the dining room, the scene of so many rewrites, and found the note waiting on the table. Clara's handwriting, broad and confident, sprawled across a scrap of paper. "You made this ugly." No signature needed. Her voice lived in those words, dismissive, controlling, always pushing the blame away from herself. I picked it up, let my eyes trace the letters, and felt a small, almost imperceptible smile tug at my lips. For the first time, her words didn't pierce. They rolled off, shallow and brittle. I folded the note in half, then in half again, until it was a small square I could crush in my fist. "No," I whispered into the quiet. "I didn't make this ugly. I made it mine." The words echoed back, not loud but certain. I carried the folder with the deed to the counter and slid it back into its drawer, the paper smooth and steady beneath my palm. The notepad, too thick with ink, rested inside. I closed the drawer firmly, sealing them in, not because I was hiding them, but because I no longer needed to clutch them like a shield. They were there, ready, undeniable. But tonight, I didn't need proof to breathe. I stepped out onto the deck. The air was cooler now, carrying the salt of the sea and the faint smoke of extinguished candles. I sat down on the wooden chair I had claimed the very first morning, facing the endless dark of the ocean. The horizon was invisible, swallowed by night, but I could hear the water waves pushing, pulling steady, eternal. I inhaled deeply, the sound of the tide sinking with my breath. Silence wrapped around me, not heavy this time, but light. For years, silence had meant erasure, being cropped out of photos, being talked over at tables, being dismissed as dramatic. Tonight, silence meant something else. It meant space. It meant peace. It meant ownership. My hands rested on the arms of the chair, fingers still faintly ink-stained from the notepad palms, calloused from work that no one had seen. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt no need to defend myself. The house was mine. The silence was mine. The horizon, unreachable but steady, was mine. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm of the waves carry me. Not revenge, not even triumph. Just recognition. The story had been rewritten, and this time I was in the center. Silence, I realized, was not absence. Silence was presence. Silence was proof. Silence was ownership.